Time to put on my on personality.
Oh man, imagine having an on and off personality. Anyway, what you guys have already missed starting right now is we've talked about how Twister Sticks is kind of like DMT because you potentially shit your pants and slap yourself in the face, but you might also have a good experience as well. And what was the other cool thing that we said that I've already forgot?
So- Well, I don't even know, man. And we were actually on time, so that's our first win, and that's what we'll start from there.
Mm.
Yeah, cool. We're gonna start with the topic of psychedelics and whatever happens after that may as well. Now, Brandon, I'm imagining you're super excited and you want to get some stuff off your chest. So I'll open the floor to you first. Yeah, DMT recently. How did that go for you?
So I tried DMT on Saturday with four other people, close friends, and we sat for each other. I did it through a vaporizer pen, which it had been reported you have to take multiple hits to break through, as the expression goes, um, and basically hit it as long as you can for as long as you can until you feel some changes. And I did. The first time I didn't really quite know what was going on, and it lasted about 10 minutes. Um, but I remember it being very like ineffable. But the second time I went in, I took 2.5 hits. I managed to keep the vaporizer in my hand, and I had a near-death experience. And I didn't even know what to call it until much later. But the thing that I came out with was that I'm not afraid to die because I had this misconception about death. And but everything else I couldn't describe because I was there's too much information going on. But I remember feeling my last human breath. That's what the experience was having me do. And I was just like, whoa, that's it? They just stopped breathing. And then people would pass away in my life. I was like, that's what they feel? Oh, whoa. And then I came to, and then I was just like, whoa. That's that's pretty much what I experienced on Saturday. I'm still kind of processing that profoundness, but I have to say things tasted pretty good after like food and drink and laughing. I was just kind of like, yeah, this is really cool.
I guess
Wow.
like I've never done DMT or anything quite like it, but and it'd be awesome to hear all of your opinions. If you guys want to jump in, feel free. But does the experience kind of change with time as you reflect on it? I imagine there's so much going on, and there's probably some richness to it. Is it kind of like a terrible metaphor, but is it kind of like chocolate or wine or cheese where like it might be really strong and a little hard to grasp or appreciate, and then you maybe come back to it, whether you do it again or not's another thing, but you come back to it again and again, and either by doing it or reflecting on it, and the taste kind of changes over time, or it kind of teaches you a different lesson when you reflect.
Sort of half bad analogy, actually. Um, I think not necessarily the substance itself, from my experience anyway, but the lesson sort of, yeah, it matures. I think, as Brendan described, a lot of it is very ineffable, and it's so out of this world that it's hard to link to things. But then, as that time goes on, I felt, well, as time has gone on, I found that it starts to like show itself up in a more relatable way, and it starts to make more sense, and you can palate it a lot easier, to go with the continued analogy there.
Hmm.
How cool is it that you get to no longer be afraid of death from having a 10-minute experience with a chemical? Do
That's
people know
DJ,
about
that's
this?
what I mean, can you imagine like if all of us got to experience a little bit of that and then for our own selves, like just not be afraid of change or transformation. And then the shackles of a lot of things just disappear, right? Like um and a lot of I realize too is like it's okay to have the struggle going and being a human being, like go with all the ups and the downs because you're going to miss all of those at the end. And I was like, yeah, I've been kind of avoiding like the ultimate lows. I don't know about you guys, but I definitely avoid those. And then I was like, but you can't unless you really like, we shouldn't prevent people from hitting rock bottom, I don't think.
I think that is like experiences like that are more important now than ever because we don't have those built-in perspective shifts that I think you would get when you're just trying to survive and you have real actual near-death experiences and loss of loved ones and death. We're so protected and comfortable now, that I feel like something safe and controlled like psychedelics done properly is can enrich your life like these other things, psychedelic events that we've evolved growing up with, that show you the fragility and the beauty of life all around you. That's always there. That we kind of are sheltered from in a way in modern
Mm.
times.
Mm,
Yeah, I definitely see elements of that even without psychedelics. I mean, I think your point about allowing people to hit rock bottom is super important. I don't know about you guys, but I think that all of us can kind of think of a relative personal best when it comes to being low. And when I think of that time, I actually realize that that's the time where soon after I probably experienced the most growth. And that didn't have anything to do with drugs. I'd never taken drugs before. But I think being able to notice that you're in a relative low, appreciate that that is something that's going on, and that at some point something's going to change, whether you like it or not, for the better or for worse. I think being able to kind of relate to a moment like that, accept it, and then see transformation kind of occur, I would say due to the acceptance is really important. I mean, I've got a
mm,
couple people close to me who um, seem to be at relatively low points, and it's really interesting, kind of hearing opinions of them shared about one another. Mostly around the family. One person says something about another person. They're all in relative low points, and it's kind of like, yeah, but I kind of feel like when you hit that point and you realize you've hit that point and you accept that you hit that point, things start to happen for the better, provided those things get to happen first, which is really cool. Yeah.
yeah, the acceptance of it too. I think, yeah, like being really close to versions of death, right? Like, whether it's like even death in your own community as a person, right? Like personality or whatever you're known for. Like, I mean, I think when we're, at least when I was younger, I clung to the identities that really got me attention and that got me some kind of accolade, like, mostly being smart because I didn't have the physicality, and then I latched on to physicality, and even those things like changing from a weightlifter to just a regular person was very, very hard. Like I had to die to that, and I really clung to that because there's a lot of respect and attention that goes with that, and I don't think people want to let go of things that give them payout, you know?
Yeah, for sure. It kind of reminds me of a thought I had a few years ago where I was like, I think the world would be a really interesting place if people could find a way to get people close to the feeling of death without ever dying. And this was before I had any concept of what hallucinogens or hallucinogenic experiences could kind of elicit. I thought, yeah, it'd be really interesting if we could play with the brain in a point where a person comes to a place, they have an appointment at 9 a.m. on a Tuesday, they die for half an hour or whatever, then they come back afterwards. I just thought, like, well, what would that mean for people? How would it change them? But it's really interesting kind of seeing the parallel between that and what hallucinogenic experiences, especially like DMT, seem to provide for people.
Yeah, we can sort of get stuck in this like this expectation, like so DJ mentioned that everything like you're meant to be healthy, you're meant to live this long life, and we so disconnected from the idea that we're going to die because we think we can just live longer and longer and longer, and medicine will save us and all these things will save us, And it's just simply because we're not exposed to that reality frequently. And when we are, we go through all these processes of denial. And to go on what Brendan said, I think that happens with in so many different like smaller scales as well. Like when we change identities, when we change who we are as athletes or as coaches or whatever it is. And it's psychedelics gives us an experience of that that's really rich and deep. And then all of a sudden it does become so much easier to let go of other things. And it gives you this framework and gives you this perspective that just breaks things down and removes that struggle when it comes to letting go of small things and then bigger things and bigger things again, and eventually life.
Do you guys think that psychedelics are technology?
I think that's a functional way to look at it. I mean, I like it better than the new agey interpretation of it, because it's a technology in the way that it gives you information, or it gives you new information, right? So it's not like we're more enlightened or being shown some sort of truth, and now we're superior. It's like there's a tool like anything else, like a microscope or telescope, to look in a different direction and explore and gain information. I think that's a pretty agnostic way of looking at this tool of psychedelics, because it is about changing your mind and your brain, and in turn your reality, because your reality, your subjective reality, is merely just your interpretation of information.
I think I agree with DJ there. I would say that it's like a tool is a nice word. I think that any word you use to try and describe this is going to have some connotation or loading to it that's not going to quite do what we're talking about justice, and that's fine. We've all kind of accepted that and moved on. I think that, being in good old CA, technology is pretty prevalent over there. It's part of language, and therefore it's part of how you describe things. DJ thinks about lifting rocks and tools, and he's a big old primate, and he uses that language to describe things. I think of it as kind of a connective network, and I don't like the word network. I like the word connect, but I still think that even connect has some sort of bias to it that I don't really like. But what I see, and the way that I associate to it the most, is actually through the philosophy of a guy named Deleuze that I talk about a lot. Now, this guy has a theory about rhizomatics. That's actually about moss, not mycelium, but moss grows in lots of different directions and also dies in different directions. It's not particularly easy to judge when something's growing or dying in a given direction. And moss can be on a tree. Tree can grow out of moss. It can be on a rock. It can be rolling. It can be static. That's kind of the way that I think about it. And I think that I like that analogy because there's not too much attachment or bias to moss. Not many of us have thought about moss regularly. So I like the language that I get to use there because we can kind of take at least some of the bias or connotation out of it because we don't have a lot associated with moss. And therefore, it's just a nice way to access it. I would say that if you look at different levels, the internet's a kind of moss and the brain is a kind of moss. And then, in turn, moss is potentially a tool or technology. So like if I can be so cunning with language, that's the way that I would think about it personally.
I like that.
Yeah. Moss it is.
Yeah, I was kind of looking to hear from you, Dan, because yeah, I was gonna say I was kind of looking to hear from you, Dan, because like Brandon kind of used technology, DJ used tool, I used moss. Like maybe it's your turn, and we can go with moss if you want, but
yeah, I'm a little bit of a chameleon. I'm just gonna take moss off you. No, it's I think my language around it generally is the word tool, similar to DJ. But I like the idea of it also being a technology in the sense that it not only helps us do something else and that we can already do, but it does it easier for us. It makes the process more simple. So it can take us into a state that might still be achievable without it. And many people say they've had psychedelic experiences without psychedelics themselves. But it's like an accelerated form of taking us into a place where we can get a different understanding or whatever it is. But in that same sense, it is then a tool. But technology is also a form of tool. So, or about technology. Or
I do, man. Okay, I just had a thought, like with the technology piece, like like when you've been browsing on your computer and sometimes it gets slow and you need to clear the cache of like old files. I feel like that's what a good. I feel like that's what fitness did for me, but it was too far and few in between experiences, like hitting PRs and stuff. But I feel like psychedelics clears out the mental cache in your nervous system too. Not like the thoughts that kind of linger, but they give you tension unnecessarily in your body. Because I've noticed every time I've done like a psychedelic, my nervous system changes a little bit. My posture and my alignment and my relationship to my fitness always changes, and I'm always excited to see like what has changed.
Yeah, that's the plasticity potential our brain has, and that psychedelics just, yeah, they clear all the psychological aberrant, like scar tissue in a sense, those pathways that get ingrained, and they give you a chance to change the story by getting out of them. And I I think that's a good metaphor of the clearing the cache, because it gives you the opportunity to de-pattern high order beliefs,
Mm,
behaviors,
yeah.
addictions, all these things.
Oh,
I
yeah, and like
couldn't
that's yeah.
I couldn't help myself but think, save your thought, Dan, because this is going to be one that ends this line of conversation, at least briefly. Um, I couldn't help but laugh at DJ talking about like it clearing scar tissue. Psychedelics are just like foam rolling for the mind.
Yeah,
Theragun?
yeah.
They're like Theraguns?
like Theragun, like yeah, Theragun
It's
attached to a.
it's more like a body tempering. Uh, super D. If anyone gets that one, it's like a 500-pound iron tube you'd lay on your body.
Anyway, what were you going to say, Dan? Sorry for ruining that for everyone.
Nothing can be ruined. Yeah, I was just like, if we look at it as in the concept that the brain is filtering the way that we can observe consciousness. Like our mind is simply our own perception of that. So every time we take the psychedelics, even if we look at like the research base on it, it kind of slows down some of the brain activity. So we're dispersing that filter, and then it sort of comes back and reforms just a little bit different. And then that's that change in perception. That's that change in posture, because your filter's been altered slightly. You're a slightly different person now because your mind is presenting something different to you as a result of that. Yeah, same idea, the clearing of the cache or the rearranging of whatever it is there.
I think it's cool as well because, like, when you think about it, we're not talking about anything different from every other experience in reality. Like, every experience is part of an accumulation. Every experience kind of changes your filter, but you kind of become aware of the gravitas of, like, one experience in the realm of many. So I think it's funny how so many people want to kind of treat psychedelics as this amazingly different thing because of the way it makes you feel. It's very hard not to be biased, and I think even clinging to and appreciating the bias is part of the experience, which is fun. But yeah, it's also nice trying to remove yourself from that and still realize that you've just had an experience, and that an experience can mean that much to you regardless of psychedelics or not.
Yeah, I think Brandon, we talked about this last time. Like my definition of psychedelics is an umbrella in which the chemical compounds are under. Like I think that's a tool of psychedelics, but I think life is psychedelic. people are psychedelic, conversations, ideas, experiences. I think psychedelics are just perspective shifters. Can I say that? They're just they just kind of reframe concepts and reality, and that can come, and that could come right now at this moment, just looking around and dropping in. But I think the mascot for that, and is these psychedelic drugs.
You, man, like what? Okay, so I have to share a story. I actually had never ever, I've never done ayahuasca or seen it in person until yesterday. I actually got to touch the vine. A friend of mine had, because it's decriminalized in Oakland, so he was able to receive. Uh, he was basically going to cook it for a week, so I got to split the bark and crumple it up so that they can make the brew. And I was like, how the fuck did they figure out how to do this? Like, I couldn't get a handle on how somebody could cook it for this long and take it from this plant. Like, what the actual fuck, you know? And then, like what DJ said, like, there's got to be so many more networks of information. Like Joel, when you were saying moss, right? Somebody's ideas, somebody's story, somebody's experience must have like shifted someone's thinking enough for them to go like, I'm gonna cook this thing. And I
Mm.
just I like those stoner moments where I'm just like, how did somebody do that? That's crazy.
Yeah, it's so fun, and I think that another thing I want to pick on that DJ said is like the power of conversation. It's funny how even when you talk to somebody about experiences you've had, in some ways you're kind of taken back to that place, and it does feel psychedelic almost. You're like, you become grateful or whatever it was that you wanted to feel about that again, and you almost feel a similar shift despite having done nothing in terms of, well, maybe something in terms of chemicals, but not directly ingesting anything at the time. I find those experiences super interesting as well, And a question I want to ask from you guys, unless you really want to pick or add to that in any way, is when was the earliest kind of time that you found yourself reflecting in a kind of psychedelic way that seemed maybe uncharacteristic or uncanny for where you were?
I feel like all of our childhoods were psychedelic, probably more psychedelic the earlier you get in the developmental process. And I think that's the cool thing about it, is you like are are a child again, in wonder, in awe, like the ineffable, right? And I think that's biological, just how our brains are back then, and the default mode network isn't on, and you're super highly plastic, just learning, soaking up stuff, which functionally you don't want as an adult. We kind of need to have our routine, know it, and survive, and just get through the day. So yeah, it's refreshing to get to that state again. Um, yeah, I get little hits of it all the time. I can't remember. Uh, I, I mean, the one I remember is psychedelics. My first psychedelic experience with mushrooms. But yeah, that all the time, like we said, talking to people, having a thought, shit, listening to Neil deGrasse Tyson talk about the cosmos, lots of things.
Oh, that's fair. I was just wondering if there are kind of any moments for any of you that jump out as like particularly, um, let's say, a little unusual for someone X age to potentially think or feel. If there's kind of, you know how they talk about psychedelics playing with memory a little bit, and how you can kind of remember certain moments within trips in a way that is
Hmm.
just, it's seemingly more detailed than, normal life, so to speak. I guess it's just an interesting thing to consider, because one of the ones that I'd like to share was when 9/11 happened. Obviously, in Australia, it was very, very different to in the US, but my grandmother tried to explain this to me, and I think I was 6 years old, maybe 7 years old, depending on. No, I was 6. Um, and I just remember having kind of like what you were saying before, Brandon, that idea where you just have a question that leads off into the distance. I just kind of said to my grandmother at the age of 6, like, why do people do that to each other? And then there was like this really long, interesting moment of silence that I still feel like I can still remember the details of being next to her, the song that we were listening to, the car that we drove. And for me, that feels like a really psychedelic moment, despite, you know, being 6, never having even known about drugs. I just wondered if you guys had any moments kind of like that where you're like, wow, that was like a childhood moment that, yeah, it kind of feels very like being on something.
Yeah, I had a moment when I was like, the one that comes to mind anyway, I'm sure there's others, but when I was like 14, and I had a very near-death experience in the sense that I drank myself into a coma, literally.
Hmm.
I'm pretty close to dying. Heart rate was in like the 20s or something when they found me lying in a park by myself, um, as you do at 14. And I remember afterwards having a conversation with the nurse, and she sort of asked me why I do that. Why did I think I should do this? And I looked at her and I said, that's a really good question. And I remember pondering on that for a long time, and then having conversations with a couple of close friends that weren't part of that experience. Obviously, my friends left me in the park at that moment. Of course, they were scared. They didn't know what to do. We're all young. But it was one of those things, it was like, why do we do the things that, you know, are putting us in danger and not meant to be doing for the sake of other people? And then it sort of got me thinking around, you know, how influenced we are by those social structures and those connections. And it was, yeah, it just took a whole bunch of lime essence to get there.
Well, I'm glad that nurse was there to make sure you're still living, because you wouldn't be able to tell us that story if she wasn't there.
Yeah, got lucky that one.
Damn, Brandon, DJ, are there any that you wanna tell? You wanna jump out? I mean, I don't want to rush anybody, but yeah, it's a like there's a lot of gravity in that story.
I feel like you have
Oh,
one, Joel.
Oh, I was telling the one about 9/11.
Oh, right.
That's fine. I mean, yeah, I think there was another really interesting moment at about like 18 where I had a dream that I was in World War II kind of era. Adolf Hitler was in front of me, and he shot me, and I actually didn't care that I died. And that struck me as a really, really uncomfortable thing. I was like, well, if I don't care about the fact that I died, like, what am I really living for right now? And within the week, I broke up with my girlfriend at the time purely because of that dream. Um, and I had this thought that kind of crystallized from that moment where I thought, right now, the combination of things that exist, whatever they are, aren't the right combination because I've been really, really sad for a really long time. So I just need to do something different. And as a result, I started seeing a life coach. I went to a gym. I started just practicing doing a couple of things every week that I wanted to do. And that's kind of what, yeah, I would say changed my direction from where it was to where I feel like I am now. So maybe I'm being a little self-indulgent in double storying, but yeah, I think that that was kind of another moment that was really striking for no particular reason that just I can't seem to forget or let go of.
man, thanks for sharing that. I mean, I do want to share one. I also want to take in like that, these are like big life stories that it takes a long time for people to share sometimes. So thank you guys, because
Yeah,
um,
and thank you for kind of taking the time to realize that. For anyone who is listening, appreciate that there are little gaps after each of these stories, because when you hear this and when you've kind of experienced these things, you don't want to just kind of blurt out one by one. You do want to let it sink in, and that's kind of what we're all doing. So yeah, there's that. And shout out to Crystal. You're probably not listening, but I'm sorry I broke up with you and never actually told you about that dream. So on the off chance you hear this, at least you know that I broke up with you because of a dream.
Joel, I actually want to tell you a similar story about when I watched the movie 300. You remember that movie?
I've never seen it.
Well, anyway,
This is
How
Sparta.
okay,
dare you,
well,
Joel?
it's a spark. I know. How dare you come unprepared for this story? Well, there's a scene in that movie where they talk about the Spartan boys having a rite of passage called finding your wolf, which is you basically have to go find an animal that is dangerous and go kill it. And I realized I had not had that moment when I was like just out of college or in my last year of college. And I ended up breaking up with my girlfriend of 6 years at the time because of that movie. And then I found out that the actors or whatever who were in the movie did CrossFit, and I didn't know what that was, but I knew it was cool as fuck, and I wanted to be like that. But I had never thought of myself as anything other than what I was. I was just content being who I was. But then I wished that I was someone else. That was the first moment that I was like, not only wishing, but I was determined to become somebody else. And I told her, and she was like, "What the fuck, Wolf? I don't know what the fuck you're talking about. Get the fuck off the phone with me. I don't want to talk to you." And I was like, "I gotta find my wolf. I gotta find my wolf." And so I think for young men, fitness is that wolf, right? That unconquerable thing that you gotta just do. But it changed the course of my life. And Michelle, if you're listening, which you probably are not, it was because of a movie that I broke up with you.
Uh,
Jesus.
I'm so glad that we didn't come into this with a script. We wouldn't have had any of this stuff to talk about. That's a lot of fun.
These are just all psychedelic stories of you guys leaving your significant others.
Yeah, and not
Oh
even
yeah,
related to
abandonment on their
drugs. It's
side,
too
you
bad
know.
apart, hey.
That's the lesson. That's how you really find growth. Leave your codependency.
I was super codependent, dude. I had no idea what the fuck that was, but I was super codependent. Like, but I mean,
I let me throw one in on the pile. So
yeah.
my first psilocybin experience, I broke up with my girlfriend that day. During it was like the decision, like, oh, why
What?
am I doing that? Done. Yeah, which was a good decision.
Were you saving that one? Like,
It felt like such a build-up. There was like all this silence. You're like, oh, I've got to throw my hat in, and then you're like, yeah, I got high and broke up with my girlfriend while I was on shrooms. I was like, oh man, like I was looking for the details. Where's the richness? Tell me like where you're sitting at the time, like what you ate the dinner before you. Yeah, like I need to know the juicy details. And you're just like, yeah, like I did a thing.
Yeah. I made a decision, a decision I wouldn't have made otherwise. Very drastic, impulsive decision because of drugs. I have lots of stories like that.
Yeah. I've
well,
gone the
I
other
mean,
way.
how often do
You
go
proposed to
ahead, Dan?
someone on mushrooms,
I
Dan.
yeah, I was on mushrooms and I'd been talking to this girl for not very long, and she happened to have called me while I was tripping, and I asked her out and told her I loved her, and we ended up being together for a few months, and the entire few months I didn't want to be with her. It was not my intention. Just I was just in such a I love everyone, and I wanted to love her. So Sam, if you're listening, everything I said was probably a bit of a lie.
The dark side.
Mm.
God, like our initial reaction of what we really want to do, like that first impulse, I feel like it's we shouldn't always act on it, but at least be aware of like the first impulse we have for something. Like whether it's attraction or fear or anger. Like, I feel like as a culture, we're taught to completely skate over those things, and that's why psychedelics are so traumatic. Because, oh, I'll tell you a story. I actually met Eckhart Tolle, and I volunteered at one of his retreats, and I asked him, in the group, like the whole hall, I asked him like what he thought about psychedelics, and he just takes his like, hmm, psychedelics are a sledgehammer into the present moment. They don't let you be anywhere else but the present. And I was like, oh shit, that's some truth right there. And
Nice.
when people have lived in the future or their past for too long, like in the trauma or wherever, or the future of fear, boom, it's so traumatic to get to the present moment because they'd almost never been there. And then they call it a bad trip
Mm.
Hmm.
because it's an unexpected trip, as like, some people would say. But yeah, you get sledgehammered into the present, man. And if you're ready for that, though, like DJ, you probably got sledgehammered into the money, like, I'm not doing this anymore. Fuck this.
Well, I talk about that story a lot, my first experience, because it was not done in a therapeutic setting. It was recreational. I thought it was like a weed where I was going to get high. I had no idea what mushrooms were. I took way too much, which was the right amount for me. And I got confronted with everything. Um, Everything I was holding up as my identity, my story, all the clothes I had put on. And if for the first time, I was like, oh, I have actual freedom. I have the choice if I want to be this or not. And that was kind of the come to Jesus moment. And that's when I, broke up with the girlfriend. That's when I stopped doing drugs at the time. That's when I stopped hanging out with, like, I decided this is not the person I want to be, and I'm just going to change it. And I think that day saved my life. It, I would not be who I am, where I am today, if not for that experience of potential freedom and responsibility that I didn't know I had. So, yeah, I mean, I'm thankful for that. I'm thankful for I mean, you could call it facing the shadow, but it's really the chance to integrate, to make decisions, and to change your story when you realize it is just a story.
Yeah, that the idea of it just letting you know that you have the freedom to change. Like, I resonate with that so much. That's how I would describe my first experiences too. It just gave you that moment to go, I don't need to keep doing this for any reason other than my own choice to do it.
Yeah, isn't it funny how we have this conception of what mushrooms or LSD or whatever we're thinking that this drug is going to do for us? Really, like, I mean, there's, it's almost like it's almost a gift that it's hidden like from us. It kind of takes us off guard. Like, if people could communicate exactly what it did, I think a lot of people wouldn't uh they wouldn't sign up for that, which I
Yeah, well,
think
I
is
think
part
I
of.
think I think like going back to your wolf story and going back to your fitness story, it's like if you could concentrate the cumulative DOMs and sweat and all of the things that you might feel in a decade's worth of fitness, and you package that to somebody and you said, well, if you experience all of this, you can be different at the end of it. I think, yeah, if you're faced with that kind of immediate pain for a potential change afterwards, it would be pretty scary, and it would be something that maybe people would shy away from. I mean, pain is not something we lean into often, and some people don't realize that you can kind of choose pain in some ways, but realize that it's potentially necessary in the long run.
Hmm. Yeah, I like how Dr. Matt Johnson, who's he runs the clinical trials for psychedelics at Johns Hopkins. He calls psychedelics a chemically facilitated learning experience. So it's going to be
Hmm.
very hard, you know, hard lessons, but you will learn and you will have the potential to grow from this experience. And I think just the data on how it's one of the most effective things for breaking addiction, you know, because it doesn't fight the chemical addiction, it fights your relationship to yourself and to your habits and your behavior. And what's interesting is that it's correlated to the um, the intensity of the mystical experience, not so much the dose, determines how effective it is for changing behavior. And that fascinates me because you're saying mystical in scientific studies, which is pretty cool. But that really is what's going to determine and correlate to how much it changes you as a person is how mystical and ineffable and spiritual it is.
It is very interesting, and I think when you talk about learning experience, it definitely rings a bell in my head. I think that one thing that most of the education systems we probably all grew up with have in common is that they don't connect to the learner particularly well. I mean, you might have a teacher or a class or something that once in a while does connect to you and does stand out. But I think the thing that's interesting about psychedelics is that it is connected to you. It's about your experience, as you said. It is mystical. It's in terms you understand because you create language while you're in that experience that is your language. So I think that it
Hmm.
probably is what I would say is quite essentially a learning experience. It's hard to avoid because we start with connection to the learner, and then we fill in the blanks as we go. You know, and I think that that's something that I really do appreciate. And I wish that teachers, personal trainers, physical therapists all thought about a little bit more, like, okay, well, what's the person in front of me actually want? What might they need but not be aware of? And then, is there a way that we can kind of realize that while also giving what they perceive as right? It's an interesting kind of connection to deal with, but that's a learning experience for me. If you don't connect to the person you're teaching, then yeah, what's the point in teaching at all?
I- I think that is one of the issues with the standard fitness model is that it is not actually built for teaching. And I think that's why all of us are probably outliers in this kind of, I guess, model. But imagine if, like, steroids is sort of an accepted use of technology. What if psychedelics were an accepted use in fitness culture to break people's personal stories so they could be open to learning, and the people who were passing on this knowledge understood how important their role was, and not just like barking out orders, but providing this place for somebody to discover something for themselves.
Yeah, for sure. And I would definitely say the same thing about the education system. Like, my belief is that really there are only three ways language works or operates. You can create, you can persuade, and you can inform. And informing and persuading are two sides of the same coin in my thought. If you kind of link that to psychedelics, I would say that there's definitely something creative about them. They're definitely persuasive, and there's definitely some sort of information slash persuasion complex in them. So I think that, yeah, with both learning and with the potential breaking of a story or a personal complex, there's a lot of interesting things that go on.
I think the cool thing about psychedelics is the persuasion it holds is internally driven. It it's you who are finding the solutions, and it's not coming from an external source. And I think that's why it's so powerful, and that's why it's so subjective. And you hear these stories come out that are like, okay, you must have been high, but it's like what that person needed and how they needed to interpret it to make change. And there's almost like an ethical firewall built in to psychedelics where
Mm.
it's hard to be you start to question external motivations and external solutions that are forced, and you really dig deep to find an organic one. um, Once again, like when it breaks addictions, it's like it breaks the addictions that you think you have. If it's a healthy addiction, it doesn't break it. Even a healthy addiction, I heard reports like people who stop meditating so incessantly because they thought it was becoming obsessive. People, me myself, I found a point where I was like, do I really want to be this like movement hipster just to be different person? Like, I actually enjoy just getting a pump and broing out, you know? So I think the lesson you get is totally subjective. That is a gift and a curse in a way, but I think it's a beautiful thing.
Mm. Yeah, and I think that there's definitely something interesting about it because when I talk about motivating people and teaching moves people kind of stuff when I'm working with those guys, one thing that becomes pretty clear is when you look at personal change, the gold standard is probably Alcoholics and Narcotics Anonymous from the amount of people that they've managed to change. And fundamentally, they use act, belong, commit, self-determination theory, and that kind of would say that on a spectrum from extrinsic to intrinsic motivation, people who are quite intrinsically motivated most of the time will generally get more of the changes done over time as well. So it's kind of like if you find uh, a substance or a source of internal motivation that's just easily consumable, yeah, is there something that's maybe more transformative than that? I'm not sure because, as you say, internal motivation might not be easy to find many other ways unless you really go looking for it. And even then, you could be that person that meditated a whole lot thinking, this is going to internally motivate me, but that's still an extrinsic motivation, right? That's the change you want to see happen externally. So it is really interesting how that can be a perceived feeling from taking the psychedelics.
Yeah, I like
Uh,
that. Because how do you generate that strong internal motivation without rock bottom or a kick in the ass from life or external circumstances? It's very hard to generate just through willpower.
Yeah, unless you're kind of, taking steps up the external motivation chain until you get to more internally motivated behaviors that are still kind of rocky. Yeah, how do you get there? And you look at something like fitness. How long does it take for the average person to get to a point in their journey where they would say, I am internally motivated by fitness and I'm comfortable saying that, like we're really talking for me, like I'm 8 years in and I'm still not certain that I feel that. So like if you can kind of just, pop something in your mouth and 10 minutes, 4 hours later, that's completely changed. It's mind blowing at that level, I think.
DJ, I really like what you said, the ethical firewall. That is such a good description of the protective. I don't know how it's built into these substances, but they backfire when people try to abuse them. It's almost like they understand human psychology and how we like to cheat, lie, and slither our way through things. And it's just like, nah, brah, not gonna. You can try whatever you want. And it's like the best wrestler you've ever encountered. And you're just like, I'm 2 years into grappling. I can get out of this. And they're just like, sorry, we're gonna squeeze the shit out of you.
Mm.
And you know it's coming. It's like, but how is that built in? That's what fucking blows my rocker is like, how is that built in?
I
Or
like
maybe I'm
the
making that
metaphor
up.
of like imagine you're trying to like write something into someone's brain, like an idea or a belief or an agenda, but psychedelics is an eraser. So it's like you could never really um, get it in. If anything, you like McKenna says, it's boundary dissolving, right? So when institutions and authorities try to harness that, yeah, it usually doesn't work.
So technically, we're very dangerous people.
Hmm.
If we have erasable technology, like you're like, oh, try to imprint me most of my life, and then you're physically capable, like it's hard to catch a strong and agile person. Literally hard to catch and squirming person. So, but isn't that how humans were supposed to be? Like healthy, hard to catch, hard to kill, both in the mind? Like it's like our bodies are still alive, but like something has killed our minds through like the way that society has kind of like I don't know too many people who've died happy in my life.
Hmm.
Hmm.
Like
I think if
having lived through standard programming.
I was gonna say, like, I can kind of uh, discuss and riff on that a little bit, like culturally speaking. Going back to Deleuze, my little child of wisdom, um, and I talked about the moss earlier and how I feel like psychedelics may be kind of moss or moss-like in some particular ways. Uh, he posits that the opposite is arborescence, like a tree. We grow in a direction. There may be branches, but we all still stick to a central trunk. In philosophy and especially psychological philosophy, Freud is considered that trunk where we analyze everything. There's always motives that can be deducted and analyzed, and there's scientific reason involved. And um, that's kind of the arborescent complex of society where things are limited to a tree. But it's interesting to note that, yeah, once again, if you look at the root systems of trees, they're often connected to mycelium, to moss, and then moss to trees and vice versa. So I think that it's interesting how at times you can feel like the arborescent nature of society where hierarchies exist potentially gets in the way, and especially with the psychedelic experience when you feel the potential expansive or exploratory possibilities of something like that, you may feel a little trapped in things. But I also find it really interesting that um, you kind of need to have a balance between arborescence, mycelia, moss. You need to have trees in a forest, you need to have moss in a forest, and you need to have fungi and mycelia in the forest for it to function. So I think that finding a balance is definitely interesting and necessary. But if you look at how categorized and hierarchalized society is these days, you're like, wow, that tree grew real tall. And I think that maybe the shade is not given the moss much room to grow, and that the mycelia are probably ready to sprout any moment now. But are we going to see a balance? You just don't know.
Mm. Yeah, Brandon, yeah, that point you made about modern man being not dying happy or not dying with grace, I feel like that's a product of just a spiritually starved society. And I think I feel that. I mean, until my recent ayahuasca experience, I consider myself, I said agnostic, but I was an atheist. Like, I didn't believe in any higher power, but it was nice to think about. But I feel like maybe that's because Western science kind of replaced it, which isn't good or bad, but it did kind of move out uh, or displace that ineffable mystical uh, part of life that I think the psychedelic experience can, inject back in. And I think that's why it's so important. And hopefully we get to see this for, um, patients who are chronic, terminally ill. Um, I think they need this medicine the most.
Yeah, end of life, hospice care, that's um, I have several friends connected to MAPS and they have done hospice work and they truly believe like in helping people die gracefully and with that experience of having Like if they couldn't feel it in life, at least give them the last taste before they go from this mortal coil. And you know, the stories that they tell me are like tear jerking, man, because they're just like these people are like, thank you. I I feel something. And then they're like, I'm ready to go. I mean, just saying that I'm ready to go. Like, how fucking rocking is that when you're just like, okay, I've had my time here. Let's transform. You know, instead of like, I don't want to die. I'm scared of it. Just clinging to everything because it's hard to watch a person who's clinging to the end of their life when they don't feel good about the end of their life.
Mm. And even for the people around those people as well, and they can put almost this like emotional stress on that person as they try to cling on to their life or try to cling on to the other person's life. But you know, like an experience like you had, Brendan, imagine if someone who was going through the death of someone else could experience that and know that it's okay, and it would reduce all that pressure on that person and let them go with more peace and let them not think that they're leaving this pain and this struggle behind, and it creates just a smoother process for everyone involved.
Imagine if a family could do
Hmm.
that together and share that experience. Oh man, be a different
Yeah,
world.
That was one of the
100%. Go Dan.
Yeah, so that was one of the sort of, I guess, troubles I had. I used psychedelics as a way to help cope with the, like, as my dad was dying, but not being able to connect with my family on that. I had to watch their struggles, and that's their, their struggles became my struggles because we weren't experiencing that same perception of what was happening. And if we had all been able to do psychedelics in a therapeutic setting together, I think the whole process for everyone would have been less painful and more joyous and more, I think to celebrate life and celebrate everything that was there. But yeah.
It is something I definitely wonder about. I grew up pretty devoutly Catholic. My family, are mostly all that way. I went to church pretty religiously for about 5 years of my life, and I don't think I skipped a Sunday in three. And I do wonder if the secularization of society maybe makes things like death and family connection and those kind of complexes even harder to approach. I say that because it might not be the same as being able to, eat a bag of mushrooms with your family, but I do wonder if sitting in a church pew or a mosque or a synagogue or whatever place of worship you might have had or have, I do wonder if simply sitting in a place where you're aiming to revere something that might be a little higher than you with people close to you might have some positive effect as well. I do wonder if, maybe that going missing might even make, it might make things harder. And you wonder if, in a sense, if something like psychedelics does eventually become legal, recreationally legal, something like that, that maybe on a Sunday families get around and talk shit while they're, high on whatever substance and get to bond that way. Maybe that is the new church, and maybe that wouldn't be so bad. It's just an interesting kind of set of thoughts I have there.
That's future human shit, man.
I think that's the archaic revival. I feel like they're doing that in
Yeah.
Peru. You know,
And it's
You know,
definitely
it's funny too. It's like,
go, Brandon.
go ahead, Joel.
Okay. So yeah, it's just something that I've thought. I mean, I recently acquired some mushrooms, and I've been kind of just microdosing for the moment. I'd never really had any experience with it, so I thought it would be interesting. And my parents recently went through a divorce, and I kind of see both sides of what they're saying to be, true from their side of experience. But I do wonder if, for example, in a situation like this where there is so much cumulative pain in a family when something like that happens, even if it's not potentially experienced that way. I do wonder if, yeah, even if it wasn't on a Sunday, if there was maybe a process where if a divorce needed to happen or if death was about to happen in the family, even if, you know, on an occasion like that, there was a clause in law that said, hey, you guys can have X amount, it'll be stationed in a particular way. I do wonder if you maybe even institutionalized it in a way like that. Would divorce be easier to deal with? Would death be easier to deal with? Would a birth be easier to deal with? Would you learn something different? It's just interesting because there are so many ways that it could pop up in society in the future that would be maybe socially acceptable or at least partially, that you could still see a lot of widespread changes happen as a result of.
I, I would love to share along that thought, and I'm sorry you had to see that, Joel. But at the same time, I'm not. I'm just trying to respect your experience because it's difficult to watch that, the resentment and any negative feelings. But I the first time I heard about two friends doing something called conscious uncoupling, and they had agreed to break up, and they both took ecstasy and sat in the same room for 6 hours, airing their grievances and what they appreciated about each other and everything. And they both acknowledged it was over, but they got to leave the residue that generally kind of stays with divorcees, because my parents are divorced, and my father's passed, you know, and it's always a strain for children to feel that from the adults. So to be able to let that go, I mean, how to let two adults just be adults again so they can find whatever version of love they want, and let the children just be like, thank God, you guys are like, this whole thing is over, you know?
Yeah, and I think that one phrase was kind of interesting there that you pointed out. Let adults be adults. Like maybe it's a bit more like you take a couple of drugs side by side with one another, and you get to actually be a bit more like a schoolyard kid than an adult. You get to say like, "Hey, Mary, I loved you yesterday. I don't love you today. Sorry, I like Sophie now." And that's kind of cool in the honesty of like, you know, a preschooler. But maybe that's the kind of environment that we need at a time like that. Maybe it's okay to, yeah, be in that way.
I mean, you guys are bringing up couples, but imagine in the political climate we're facing today, if we could do that with two opposing sides, you know, sit down, have a talk, the chemically facilitated talk, so that you are open to the other human across from you, and you are kind of seeing through the thoughts and listening to that person who is talking about real suffering and how they see the world. uh, on one hand, that's a hard thing to do. Like, would you want to give up your self-righteousness and the desire to win and dominate, you know? um, but yeah, that'd be a pretty cool world if that were happening.
Rehumanize a lot of things.
Do you guys know Rick Doblin, the founder of MAPS, the Psychedelic
Yep.
Study Association? They're the ones who are doing all the research on PTSD. Well, not all, but they're in Santa Cruz. But Rick Doblin is sort of this elfish kind of short guy, and he's been the pusher of psychedelic therapy for a long time. But he did a speech at a banquet where he was talking about his relationship with the Pentagon when they first decided that they were going to try to suggest MDMA for PTSD. And the DEA, the government, was like his fucking enemy, number one, like, because he just, like, the war on drugs, right? Is just, and he talked about how he had to do his own shadow work around that to be able to walk into the building without any residual like hate for this organization that didn't know any better about the war on drugs. And so I just thought that was really interesting. But yeah, chemically facilitated learning. You
Yeah,
got to
and I
head out,
think
DJ.
you can go, DJ. You're free to leave.
Okay. Good
Thank
chatting,
you for
boys.
coming on.
Continue. My spirit will be here with you.
Good
Peace.
to see you, DJ.
See you, DJ.
Enjoy. Have a good one, man. Yeah, and I think it's just interesting because there are so many institutions and there are so many stages that we go through, and you do wonder, like, what like if there was kind of like one institution that you could introduce to in like one way, what would it be? And I think that that's maybe even a nice way to end the conversation as well. You know, staring out into silence, kind of wondering, yeah, you know, maybe the world isn't going to be completely on board with everything. That's totally fine. But yeah, maybe there is one way that this could work, and if there was one way, it's maybe worth reflecting on.
Yeah, and I don't think it's not something that everyone needs to agree on, but it's we need to give people the freedom to experience it and to be there, and that would just make it a lot easier.
Hmm. Freedom to
Well,
choose your consciousness.
That's it.
Well, thanks for hanging out, guys. It's been an awesome chat. It's funny how time ends up just disappearing when you have conversations about stuff like this. But I appreciate your sharing. And DJ, I'm sure when you listened to this last couple minutes, thank you too for sharing. We didn't get to thank you properly. And other than that, I hope you guys have a great day.
Thanks, Joel.
Thanks for putting this together.
Yeah.
Enjoyed
I
my
hope to
time.
talk to you
Have a good
guys
one,
soon.
guys. Mm,
See you
See you
guys
guys.
online.
Peace out.
catch you later.